Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I am great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Well, we've got a long podcast this time, so we're going to go right to it. So our guest is best-selling author and Manhattan Institute Senior Fellow, Heather McDonald. It's a recording of her recent luncheon talk on her new book, When Race Trumps Merit, on how wokeism has pretty much permeated so many aspects of our lives, not only in the academy, but in K-12 education, in the workplace, even in healthcare, even in the arts. So also on this podcast is Lance Zumi, Senior Director of our Education Center, and he moderates the questions. And there were a lot of very thoughtful questions. So I hope that you will keep listening to the very end.
Heather is always interesting to listen to. And obviously her topics that she writes about in her various books and columns are varied, but she knocks it out of the park again with this terrific new book of hers. And our Lance Zumi, I will brag about him for a moment, but he does incredible work across the board, but he has really been insightful since the Harvard decision has been handed down. And you'll hear really Lance at his best when talking about this case and these issues. He's the perfect person to have as a moderator for this luncheon. I think you'll all really enjoy the back and forth discussion between the two.
And if you couldn't make this luncheon, we also have another terrific guest around the corner for our Southern California reporters. So if you haven't already signed up, we wanted to let you know that our next luncheon speaker is John Yoo. John is a law professor at UC Berkeley, and many of you know him as a Fox News contributor discussing the Supreme Court and a lot of legal matters. And going back further, he was a Bush administration official who wrote the waterboarding memo as Deputy Assistant Attorney General. His new book is The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Supreme Court, part of Regnery Publishing's Politically Incorrect Guides, called the Pig Series. And this luncheon is going to be again at the Pacific Club on August 15th. He's a terrific speaker, and we hope to see you there. So thanks all for listening, and here's Heather McDonald.
Well, thank you so much. I wish it was a little warmer, I have to say. Newport has a tendency to air conditioned, thinking this is the whole advantage. We're not in Florida, you don't need to freeze yourselves to death here. So, and I appreciate you coming into this rather gloomy room. The whole point of California, as far as I'm concerned, is the brilliant light out there. I live for it. When I arrive flying from New York, whether it's into LAX or John Wayne, my soul just flies up with the brilliance of this light, and so I will never leave California for a red state, damn it. So thank you for keeping me company here. So, and thank you, PRI and Sally, for having me. It's always such a pleasure talking to you guys and having an opportunity to think about how we get ourselves out of our present state. The signal trait of our time is this: we live by a set of fictions. The press is fair-minded and objective. Joe Biden is just fine. Jet-setting climate activists are prepared to sacrifice one iota of their carbon-consumptive lifestyles to save the planet. Other fictions are more consequential. Men can get pregnant. Here's a good one. Quote, "The most dangerous terrorist threat to our homeland is white supremacy." Any guesses as to the speaker? Joe Biden, that's right, our fine president, in his usual white-bashing mode. But the most consequential fiction of all is that any racial disparity today in any institution is the result of racism. If a cancer research lab does not have 13% black oncologists, the black share of the national population, it is by definition a racist lab that discriminates against competitively qualified black oncologists. If a law firm does not have 13% black partners, it is by definition a racist law firm that discriminates against competitively qualified black associates. If the prison population contains more than 13% black prisoners, our law enforcement system is by definition racist. The rule that racial disparities are necessarily a product of racism has affected institutions across the cultural and political landscape, perhaps nowhere more astonishingly than in the fields of science and medicine. The crazy optimists who thought that the diversity sledgehammer would never strike STEM, they were wrong. The American Medical Association insists that medicine is characterized by white supremacy. The Biden administration's Office of Science and Technology Policy declares that science deepens inequalities. The Smithsonian Institution announces that, quote, emphasis on the scientific method and an interest in, quote, cause and effect relationships are part of totalitarian whiteness. And so, pursuant to the principle that any lack of racial proportionality signals discrimination, we are dismantling meritocratic and behavioral standards that have a disparate impact on underrepresented minorities in STEM and elsewhere. Part 1 of the medical licensing exam, for example, tests medical students' knowledge of anatomy, physiology, and pathology. Black medical students score at the bottom of the grading curve. Their low scores make it harder for them to land their preferred residencies. Solution: get rid of the scores. Last year, Part 1 of the licensing exam went pass-fail to ensure that hospital departments, when choosing residents, could not distinguish among high and low achieving students. Some medical schools have waived the submission of the medical college admission test for Black applicants because the average Black MCAT score is a standard deviation below that of white applicants. The test score gap between Asian and Black applicants is even wider. The MCATs have already been redesigned to try to eliminate those gaps. A quarter of the questions now focus on social issues and psychology, to no avail. The medical school curriculum is being revised in the hope of shrinking the grade gap. More classes in social advocacy, less time in clinical practice. The federal government is shifting medical research funding from pure science to research on racial disparities and social justice. Why? Not because of any scientific assessment of need, but simply because Black researchers do more racism research and less pure science. The National Institutes of Health has broadened the criteria for receiving neurology grants because considering scientific accomplishment alone has a disparate impact. Now, having been in foster care or having used the welfare program WIC as a child will be counted as a qualification for doing federally funded Alzheimer's research. What is at stake in these revisions? Future medical progress and ultimately lives. The legal profession, which gave us the disparate impact concept in the first place, has itself become a juicy target. Upon taking office in 2021, President Joe Biden announced that he would no longer submit his judicial nominees to the ABA for a preliminary rating. Allowing the ABA to vet candidates was incompatible with the, quote, diversification of the judiciary, explained a member of the White House counsel's office. Are you kidding me? The ABA cannot open its collective mouth without issuing a bromide about the need to diversify the bar. Its leading members are obsessed with the demographics of corporate law firms and law school faculties. This is the same ABA that gave its highest rating to a Supreme Court nominee who would claim during oral argument on vaccine mandates that, quote, over 100,000 children are in serious condition from COVID and many are on ventilators. That would be Justice Sotomayor, of course, she of wise Latina judge fame. It is a measure of how far the Biden administration intended to stray from even a diversity-driven standard of competence that it saw the ABA as a roadblock. One of those diverse Biden nominees admitted under questioning in the Senate Judiciary Committee that she could not identify the subject matter of the 5th and 2nd articles of the Constitution, the 2nd article being the section that creates the executive branch of government. As Senator Ted Cruz observed, a first-year law student who could not answer those questions would flunk out of law school. In the Biden administration, however, she gets promoted up the ladder and could still end up on the federal bench. Meanwhile, bar associations are lowering standards to eliminate disparate impact. In 2020, California lowered the pass score on its bar exam because Black applicants were disproportionately failing. Only 5% of Black law school graduates passed the California bar on their first try in February 2020, compared to 52% of white law school graduates and 42% of Asian law school graduates. The lack of proportional representation among California's attorneys was proof of, as usual, a discriminatory credentialing system. The pressure to eliminate the LSAT requirement for law school admissions is enormous because it, too, has a disparate impact. A single mother told an ABA panel, quote, "I would hate to give up on my dream of becoming a lawyer just due to not being able to successfully handle this test. The problem always lies with the test and never with the test taker." You heard it here first. The LSAT requirement will be axed. So what about this foundational fiction that any disparity in any institution is the result of racism? The truth is this. The reason for the lack of proportional representation across a range of fields is the academic skills gap. And let me issue a trigger warning here. I'm going to raise uncomfortable facts, ones that many well-intentioned Americans would rather not hear. But without being able to acknowledge the skills gap, we are going to continue destroying our civilizational legacy. Let me also say that I'm talking about group averages, not about any given individual. Thousands of individuals within underperforming groups outperform not only their own group average, but thousands of individuals within other groups as well. So here are the relevant facts. In 2019, 66% of all Black 12th graders did not possess even partial mastery of basic 12th grade math skills, defined as being able to do arithmetic and to read a graph. Only 7% of Black 12th graders were proficient in 12th grade math, defined as being able to calculate using ratios. The number of Black 12th graders who were advanced in math was too small to show up statistically in a national sample. The picture was not much better in reading. 50% of Black 12th graders do not possess even partial mastery of basic reading, and only 4% were advanced. Remember these data when President Biden and his supporters vilify Americans, especially Republicans, for alleged bias against underrepresented minorities because this institution or that is not proportionally diverse. If you wonder why gifted and talented programs are being eliminated across the country, there's your reason. If you wonder why California educators continue to promote, quote, data science courses instead of Algebra 2 and calculus, it is because Blacks do so poorly in traditional math. So left-wing mathematicians concocted a phony new class, data science, which incorporates social justice concepts but very few actual math challenges in order to paper over the math skills gap with a phony math credential. The skills gap never closes. The disparities in the SAT, the LSAT, the GREs, the MCATs, and the GMATs are just as wide. The average Black SAT score in 2022 was 926 on a 1,600-point scale. That is barely a little over 450 each on the math and reading sections, compared to an average Asian combined score of 1,229 and an average white combined score of 1,098. We can argue about why those disparities exist and how to close them, something that policymakers and philanthropists have been trying to do for decades. But in light of these skills gaps, it is irrational to expect 13% Black representation on a medical school faculty, say, or among a law firm's partners under purely meritocratic standards. At present, you can have diversity or you can have meritocracy. You cannot have both. The consequences of the diversity fiction for our legal system are particularly dire. America's most complex moral and political questions have often been addressed through court decisions. The quality of reasoning in those decisions can strengthen or undermine the legitimacy of our constitutional order. Commercial matters can be just as thorny. Private parties rely on the transparency of case law to predict the outcomes of legal disputes. When President Biden declared that he was limiting himself to Black females for his first Supreme Court nominee, he radically constrained his options, since by some reports, only 2% of lawyers in the U.S. are Black females. Yet, as of January 2023, 24% of all Biden's judicial appointments have been Black females. Now consider the academic skills gap. Over half of Black law students are in the bottom 10th of their class after their first year of law school. 2/3 of Black law students are in the bottom fifth of their class. These twin constraints make a decline in our jurisprudence in a diversity regime almost inevitable. We should not have been surprised when Biden's diversity Supreme Court pick, Ketanji Brown Jackson, cited a tendentious study on Black childbirth outcomes in her recent dissent in the racial preferences case and garbled the findings of that poorly designed study. But the leaders of our mainstream institutions would rather accuse their colleagues and their country of phantom bias than acknowledge the pipeline problem. The fictions in law enforcement are as stupefying as those in STEM and the law. We are all pretending, as President Biden is fond of intoning, that Black parents are right to fear that their children will be killed by a police officer or by a white gunslinger every time those children step outside. We are all pretending that, quote, existing while Black is a high-risk activity thanks to racist whites, as the mayor of Kansas City recently proclaimed. The facts are these. Existing while Black is far more dangerous than existing while white. But the reason is the Black homicide rate. Black juveniles in the post-George Floyd world are shot in drive-by shootings at 100 times the rate of white juveniles. Who is shooting them? Not the police, not whites, but other Blacks. Blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 die of gun homicide at 24 times the rate of whites between the ages of 10 and 24. The press ignores those Black deaths because they do not fit the anti-police, anti-white narrative. As for interracial violence, Blacks are a far greater threat to whites than whites are to Blacks. Blacks commit 87% of all non-lethal interracial violence between Blacks and whites. A Black person is 35 times more likely to commit an act of violence against a white than a white is to commit an act of violence against a Black person. And yet, the national narrative insists on the opposite idea, that whites are a constant risk to Blacks, and we all dutifully play along. Everything that has been going on in the criminal justice system since the George Floyd race riots is driven by disparate impact. If you want to know why George Gascon and his progressive fellow prosecutors are not charging suspects, and why police officers are not making stops, it is because doing so will have a disparate impact on Black criminals. Even colorblind technology is racist. Speeding cameras disproportionately identify Black drivers as traffic scofflaws. The solution to such disparate impact is the same as we saw with the medical licensing exam. Throw out the cameras. The result of this deprosecution and depolicing has been widespread urban anarchy and the largest one-year spike in homicide in this nation's history. Thousands more Black lives have been lost to increased drive-by shootings, including hundreds of Black children. So how do we counteract these fictions? By refusing to be cowed by groundless accusations of racism. We must arm ourselves with the facts and be prepared to use them. As long as racism remains the only allowable explanation for racial disparities, the left wins. It is all coming down. Even the arts are coming down. Though we were once a white supremacist country, we are not that country today. Every mainstream institution is twisting itself into knots to hire and promote as many underrepresented minorities as possible. Yet those same institutions grovelingly accuse themselves of racism. Should Republican office seekers run on the restoration of merit and standards? Hell yes. Of course, the mainstream media and some in their own party will accuse them of waging a culture war. Oh, please. It is progressive elites who are engaging in cultural revolution. Most Republicans are not even playing defense. How about legislation to ban racial preferences in medical training and practice? How about eliminating the disparate impact standard in statutes and regulations? How about ending the allocation of life-saving drugs on the basis of race, as we saw during the COVID era? By all means, Republicans should promote the virtues of free markets and limited government. But the diversity regime is the nemesis of both. We must proclaim that excellence is not racist, standards are not racist, and that the legacy of Western civilization is one of unparalleled accomplishment, conferring on us beauty, freedom, and liberation from squalor and disease. In a word, speak the truth and never back down. Thank you for your attention.
First of all, it's such a great pleasure and honor to be with Heather McDonald. Heather and I actually had chapters in a book together from last year. There's a wonderful book out there, in addition to her current book, When Race Trumps Merit, previous book called A Dubious Expediency on race preferences and discrimination going on in higher education. Heather and I, and along with Rowena Itchan, we all had chapters in that book called A Dubious Expediency, well worth the read, edited by our mutual friend Gail Harriott at the University of San Diego. So Heather, I'm going to start off our Q&A session here. I'll ask you one question, but then I want to open it up to the audience, because I know Heather's terrific speech today probably has stimulated a lot of interest and ideas amongst all of you. So, but I wanted to just ask you to start off. Now, our own Sally Pipes, who is, everyone knows, is one of the nation's top healthcare experts, has just authored a chapter on African Americans and the healthcare system for an upcoming book from Encounter Publishing. So keep an eye out for that. But when I was looking through your book, I thought it was really fascinating that you brought up how the left's view of race as a social construct, as opposed to a biological reality, actually ends up hurting black people, and that in your the research that you cited, that you pointed to, black people with roots in sub-Saharan Africa actually disproportionately suffer from kidney disease due to a genetic mutation. But the left went nuts when drug companies actually tried to address this genetic mutation. And so I wondered if you could discuss how ideology is not just trumping merit, but ideology is actually trumping biological reality when it comes to these medical and healthcare issues.
Well, I would say, Lance, you're absolutely right to pick that up, but it's worse than that. I mean, they are completely inconsistent. It is a fundamental credo of the left now that race is not biological. There's no biological reality to it. It's merely a social construct that Europeans in the Enlightenment period forward devised in order to oppress blacks. That is a false concept. Race absolutely is genetically based. But on the one hand, they say there's no such thing as race. And on the other hand, they are slowing down the progress of our drug development and research by insisting that a drug clinical trial, if it's being conducted out in Iowa, has to have at least 13% black participants. Well, if race is a social construct, why does it matter? So they go back and forth and back and forth. And an oncologist friend of mine described to me a meeting last summer with Pfizer, and half of the meeting was not discussing what new cancer drugs they have in their pipeline, but how to meet the government's ever stricter, more red tape encrusted rules about diversity in your clinical trial population. And the doctors, they're all tearing their hair out. And one female was involved in a drug test, and because she wasn't able to get enough blacks in, and this was for a cancer that overwhelmingly affects white men, it had virtually no black participants. Nevertheless, her funding got yanked for no other reason than she did not kowtow to the diversity gods. So there's that. But then there's also, so here is the key to what our issue is. You can either say that disparities are the result of racism. That's the explanation that is tearing everything down. And I didn't talk about the arts, but it's just as heartbreaking there. Or you can say they're a result of behavior and academic skills gap and criminal behavior. In the area of health, this is an incredibly crucial area as well. You are not allowed to say that blacks do have worse health outcomes you are not allowed to say that that may be due to behavior. We all see now, why are we celebrating obesity? For one reason, because blacks have a higher rate of obesity. And the Scientific American came out with a special issue in the post-George Floyd mass psychosis that took over this country, devoted to racism. And one of the articles said it is racist to suggest to obese black females that they lose weight and get exercise, because we all know that their health problems cannot be due to anything within their control. The only allowable explanation is systemic racism. Well, if the left is wrong, and the reason that blacks do have worse health outcomes is not due to this phantom systemic racism, but is due to things within their control: better eating, more exercise, less smoking, less drug taking, better compliance with doctors' prescriptions, showing up to you're then consigning them to indefinitely premature death. And yet the left would rather embrace an ideology that puts black lives at risk, and we see this as well in the criminal justice system as well. When the police back off, it is overwhelmingly blacks who die. And the only people who talk about this are white conservatives. Like, we're all sitting here, but please, sir, what, Black Lives Matter? We thought Black Lives Matter. Why aren't you talking about the 2-year-old whose brain was just blown open in a drive-by shooting? We're not going to say her name because she was shot by a black person. So it's unbelievably contradictory, destructive. It's hurting the intended beneficiaries, which are blacks and Hispanics. But as I say, it is taking all of us down. China is not ending gifted and talented programs. China does not give a damn about who its best math talent is. It's finding them and throwing everything it can get at those kids. And we are saying, we're going to hold back. We're going to make Lowell High School in San Francisco to go to a lottery system because we don't like the outcomes. Too many Asians, if it admits on the basis of academic accomplishment. We're tearing down Thomas Jefferson in Virginia. Stuyvesant High School in New York has been in the crosshairs for 4 decades. It will fall unless we can start speaking the truth.
Absolutely right. I just mentioned that my upcoming book is going to be on the implosion of academic rigor in the classroom. And I've just secured an interview with a student from Lowell High School who is going to be telling me firsthand about that collapse of academic rigor in what was San Francisco's top academic high school, and it has just imploded because of the left's ideology. And that's ideology over merit, which is the subject of your great book. Yes, the first question. So the question involves how has the arts basically been affected by this war on merit, and how has it been deconstructed, and what are the outcomes in practical ways that art lovers are seeing now?
Well, this is a subject that is the closest to my heart. I am in sorrow and rage at what is happening to the things that I love most, which is above all classical music, art museums, literature. All you need to do today to take down any individual or any institution is to say that that individual institution is white. That's it. Whiteness is now an epithet. And we're all worried about racism, but what anti-white racism is fine. The European art tradition, which is our privilege to have inherited, came out of a continent that was demographically Caucasian. Sorry, that's the facts. In the same way that China, ancient China, that gave us classical Chinese opera, gorgeous paintings, was Chinese, and sub-Saharan Africa was African black. Only the West is engaged in self-immolation and saying because our traditions are historically white, they must be torn down. And so you have the Metropolitan Museum of Art mounting an exhibit that is the nemesis of everything true about art. It took a bust by a 19th century neoclassical sculptor named Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, who I think is probably second only to Bernini in his capacity to represent the pressure of flesh on flesh. And Carpeaux created a bust of an African female slave, looking over her shoulder with a look of poignant, piercing incredulity that was intended patently as an abolitionist work. The Met bought this marble bust in 2019 with one purpose: to deconstruct an earlier magnificent Carpeaux retrospective that it had mounted in 2014 that I had the good fortune to see, that paid due respect to this master of late 19th century. His works, he did works for the Paris Opera. His fountains are throughout Paris in the great 19th century renovation of that city. The Met's thesis for its most recent Carpeaux show, which was called The Fictions of Emancipation. If you're clever, you could get a hint of what this show is going to be about. The Fictions of Emancipation. In the Met's new reincarnation as an anti-racist institution, it believes that emancipation is always a fiction, and that if a white artist creates a work of abolitionist art, the real message of that artist and of that art is that the inherent condition of blacks is to be enslaved. That far from being for liberation, that any white person who dares to sculpt or portray a black person is engaged in an act of white colonialist supremacy. And trying to flesh out this thesis entailed turning on the most essential aspects of Western art, the nude. The Metropolitan Museum, which is supposed to be our standard of connoisseurship, our standard of art historical knowledge, argued in this exhibit that the nude, if it's a black nude, is somehow all about, again, white supremacy, voyeurism, hatred, ugliness. That if an artist does not name his model, in this case, Carpeaux did not name his model, he is engaged in trying to efface a black identity. There are probably 1 million artworks out there by white artists with white models. We don't have a clue what the name of the model is. It's not the tradition. And the Met is telling young black students who come in from Harlem to see this show that if that sculpted woman, we don't know her name, it's because Western art is racist. Hate Western art. Orchestras for several decades have had a tradition of auditioning musicians behind a screen so there can be no possible contamination of nepotism. You know, the conductor wants to put his nephew, which is not going to happen because conductors are perfectionists, but somebody in the audition committee wants to bring in a friend or any possible discrimination. In the George Floyd post-George Floyd mass psychosis, the lead music critic of the New York Times, Anthony Tomasini, suggested that we tear down the screen for orchestral auditions so that we can hire our first French horn on the basis of race, not skill. Because if we don't have, again, proportional representation, if black string section, if orchestral string sections are not 13% black, they are by definition racist. Never mind that there are not blacks showing up for audition. They are by definition racist, and we must lower our standards. Beethoven is racist, Bach is racist, Mozart is racist. Why? They're white. That's all you need to know. Yes.
All right, so the question is, has the National Basketball Association, the National Football League, or any of these other professional sports organizations been sued because they have more than 13% representation of blacks? And, well, I can tell you, the National Basketball Association has 0% of Japanese Americans, which I am, and so I think that perhaps there's a lawsuit there, potentially. But Heather, what do you think?
Yeah, Edward Blum should bring that suit, I guess. I mean, Americans, this is a standard conservative complaint. I mean, we always bring up the sports issue, and I've never seen a leftist asked that question, and I don't know what their answer would be. I can imagine they would say, well, that's because we actually have meritocracy in sports, but any place else, if we don't have black proportionality, it's racist. Because it's a per se rule at this point. It needs no evidence. So that's probably what they would say. But I have to say, I get a little bit frustrated talking about this because I'm often asked by podcasters, well, make a case for why merit matters. And the podcaster may just be wanting to draw me out, but I fear that he actually thinks that one needs to answer that question. And I fear that Americans are kind of indifferent to this. They sort of think, well, there's really no such thing as merit, and who really cares what our doctors are trained in, and whether we should worry when we are taken to an ER with a fatal heart attack while driving, who cares? But they do care about sports, I mean, I used to say that we've put females into combat units, which is the absolute destruction of combat readiness. Leave aside the blatant lowering of physical standards that are required to be able to say, okay, yeah, you female, go in a combat unit with male soldiers. I mean, it's a joke. It's a joke. I don't care how far out on the far end of the distribution a female is, there is no way that she is going to have the upper body strength to be able to pull out a 200-pound fellow Marine wearing combat gear. But the real problem when you put females in a combat unit is eros. You are going to introduce a romantic jealousies. They're beating each other up. They're in fist fights like crazy over in Iraq because you've got females in the army now. And I used to say, well, Americans are happy to go, destroy our military preparedness in order to qualify females for 4-star general. The only reason we're putting female in combat units is because in order to be a 4-star general, you have to have had combat duty. It has nothing to do with military preparedness. But there'll never be a female in the NFL because we understand that football, at least, is important. Now, with the trans revolution, I'm not sure I can say that any longer. And I just look forward to the first female football. Sorry, I'm a girl. This is my one time I'm going to say I'm a girl. I don't know what these center back, what are they? I just hope she gets completely crushed,
Okay, the question is basically, how do we help the kids who are trapped in a racist institution that really is actually perpetuated by the teachers' unions and other education special interest groups, and fight against the bigotry of low expectations, basically.
Well, with all respect, you were teaching and you felt like we were not honoring blacks. That's not my impression. I think that our textbooks have basically been almost purged of white accomplishment in order to elevate, to try and find black accomplishment. I mean, that's Harvard. I mean, people were tearing down the statues. Harvard got rid of the Oliver Wendell Holmes Senior Society because this is the father of the great jurist. Because he had admitted blacks into Harvard Medical School, but then the students revolted. This was in the 19th century, and he caved into the students, professors have been doing this for hundreds of years, it turns out, and deans. And of course put in his place a black man. We always are talking about, I think his name is Carver, who is said to have developed peanut butter. That's not true. I don't think that there's any dearth of effort to try to find alleged black medical researchers who have succeeded. There certainly is a debate over which 19th century and early 20th century leaders should be elevated to the top, and Booker T. Washington was decided that he was put far too much emphasis on self-help and personal responsibility to merit a place in the black activist and black nationalist pantheon. So, the existing fight between him and Du Bois continued, and Du Bois has won. Du Bois said that our root is political pressure, not self-help. And so Booker T. Washington tragically does not get enough attention. I'm going to risk throwing cold water on the admirable philanthropic instincts in this room. By all means, I get asked this all the time, what can we do? And I first note that the idea that like Republicans are racist or ridiculous. Every wealthy donor that I know in New York or here has his pet project of social uplift in black communities. The idea that, all these racist white Republicans don't care is ridiculous, whether it's after school chess, you name it. But I'm going to say this. At this point, we, so-called, have been at this for 5 or 6 decades. The left has its favored solutions, the better school funding, more school funding. We know that Title I schools are way overfunded on a per capita basis compared to suburban schools. The right has its favored solutions, charters, vouchers. At this point, there's not a hell of a lot more that we can do. The change has to come from within that culture. And I periodically say, I don't want to write about race any longer because it is so damn depressing. I am so sick of hearing the most prominent black leaders, and they're not the only ones out there because there are some extraordinarily powerful, insightful voices that are speaking for personal responsibility. But by and large, the message is tear down standards on our behalf, not we will meet your standards. The New York Post recently wrote about this settlement in New York City. The city's going to pay out $1 billion to various applicants for the teacher's exam in New York over the years who failed and failed and failed and failed and failed and never got credentialed as a teacher. By now, I hope you know that what the reason is, it's disparate impact. The exam had a disparate impact on black applicants, not because it was a racist exam, it was objective, it was at the most elementary level of trying to find out, can this teacher get in front of a classroom and be able to spell or be able to do arithmetic? And the court decided racist exam because of disparate impact, and that's always the demand. So all these black litigants have said, get rid of the exam and credentialize us. That has to change. Parents have to start monitoring their children's homework, making sure they're taking their textbooks home, not running the streets at night, not going with gangs, not getting involved in drugs. If blacks acted like Asians in all things related to academic success for 5 decades, and we still saw racial disparities, then I will be ready to contemplate systemic racism as the explanation. But right now, the behavioral disparities between the poles of Asians on the one hand and blacks on the other are so vast that it's so obvious that that's what's going on. So sure, I mean, we can continue talking about bashing the teachers' unions, and I've traditionally felt like that was too much of a safe harbor for conservatives, so it's all the teachers' unions' fault, so that they don't have to talk about the difficult issue of inner city parental dysfunction. And I thought it's too much of a scapegoat. But after COVID lockdowns, I now say, okay, I was wrong, you guys were right. The teachers' unions are unremittingly evil. Still, we cannot teach that child to read. The child and the parent has to put in the effort.
So the question is, why is all of this happening? Everything that Heather has mentioned today, why is it all happening? Is it because of the various divisions that are being tried to create it? What's the answer? Well,
before I give a why, I'm going to just continue your statement and just state the fact that Western civilization is uniquely self-canceling at this point. We are on a suicide mission. You said self-cancellation. I completely agree. And nothing is a better demonstration of that than the trans phenomenon. The West, and particularly the Anglo-West, the American part of it, is on a crusade. I mean, the trans thing is so weird that it requires very deep explanations, and the only one I can give, we are deliberately making as many young white kids as possible infertile so they will not reproduce. It's part of the Great Replacement. At the same time that we are bringing in as many unskilled third world immigrants as possible to replace us. I mean, I'm not usually at all susceptible to sort of broad systemic conspiracy type explanations. But the trans thing is so weird that you have to search for something profound because it is unlike anything in 10 millennia of human history. So, but that still begs the question, why? What is it about Western civilization? You know, I'll consider paying reparations when I hear Nigeria step up to the plate and say, we're going to pay reparations for our role in the slave trade. These are transactions. There's buyers and sellers. The slave traders came to the west coast of Africa to pick up the slaves that had been enslaved by the African chieftains and brought there in chains. They're still enslaving people. The rest of the world contained civilizations that were much more bloody than ours. The ideas with which the left fights are uniquely Western ideas. Equality, tolerance, limited government, rights. Nobody else came up with these. And we are the ones that are self-destructing. Whether it's because we do have, since the pre-Socratics forward, this instinct of self-critique. So Plato and Socrates were constantly questioning what is knowledge, what is justice, what is the basis of society. We have this instinct to question authority. Whether that now has reached some kind of apex of absurdity, I don't know. But it is the question of our time because we are destroying ourselves.
Okay, we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Okay, so the question is, what impact has the migration of children from the wealthy class in places like China had on the enrollment space and zero-sum game issue in American elite institutions?
Well, I was a month or so ago did a free speech diversity bureaucracy debate at MIT and was walking around Harvard Square for a bit, and it is so amazing. I mean, you see the Harvard tourism from the Chinese. It's a Chinese family with a 10-year-old kid. You know, this is Harvard. You will go to Harvard. You know, just imprint this on your mind. This is where you're ending up. So it is truly amazing. And I just wonder, like, when is Beijing University going to confer as much prestige? I have such contempt for our universities that I'm amazed that, but I obviously am not seeing the full picture because they still do continue to act as a magnet. I have to say, I am a pure meritocrat. In my ideal world, we would abolish all admissions offices. I hate these people. I hate admissions officers. Where do they get the gall to make these condescending judgments about 16-year-olds? This came out in the papers for the Harvard and UNC Supreme Court affirmative action cases. The Harvard admissions officer make these judgments. Well, is your character noble enough? Have you shown enough courage in your life? Oh, give me a break. Have you, little Harvard artiste that wants to craft some utopian community? The UNC admissions office talked about, our little brown people. Well, this little brown person doesn't have a good enough GPA to get a one type of scholarship, but will hope to get the other. I would go down the list and admit exclusively based on SATs. I don't care a damn bit about anything else. Holistic admissions, if we have a Harvard class that is 80% Asian and they all have 1800s on their SATs, so be it. I do not believe that that's going to be a boring class because they all play 3 instruments anyway. So that's all I need. Is the student orchestra going to be good? Yes. Okay, I'm going there. So, frankly, I mean, if the rich Chinese are getting their kids in, and those kids are being admitted, they're being admitted in a little needle. They have to get better and better. Asians have to get better and better. We set the bar higher and higher for them because admissions is zero-sum in order to make places for underrepresented, completely not qualified applicants. I say good for them. I really don't care.
I think it's interesting because I'm a huge classical music fan myself. Mozart's my favorite.
Yes,
I know.
absolutely.
We can have a whole conversation
We'll talk about
Mozart.
Da Ponte operas, yes.
No, the Ode to Joy is beyond belief.
Beethoven.
Yes, but I will mention that one observation, and Rowena and I have had this conversation, that really the people who are defending Western classical music are Asians.
Yes, absolutely.
That if it wasn't for Asians,
Yep.
who are actually, playing classical music and attending, symphonic concerts and that sort of thing, I mean, the whole undergirding of Western classical music could actually collapse.
Yes.
So, anyway, just an observation.
Yeah.
So the question is, California just recently, under the State Board of Education, voted to adopt a woke math curriculum framework. And so how is that going to affect California and, in a bigger picture, America, in its competition with China?
Well, I talked about that. That's the data science debate. Do we offer data science as an alternative to the traditional trajectory of Algebra 2? And the California board is keeping data science alive. Now, there's been surprisingly some pushback from the University of California. I never would have believed it, but it's obviously disastrous. Data science is a fake class. It is not real math. It is not, if our goal, and I couldn't give a damn what the racial complexion is of our scientific labs or our medical school faculties. I don't give a damn. But if our goal is proportional representation, you're not going to get there by data science unless we really jettison the standards for medical school admissions. And I'm not going to like change my stripes here and actually be optimistic for once. So I should stick to my usual pessimism and say, okay, it'll come. It will come. We will start having medical schools say, you can't do calculus, you can't figure out regression analysis, come on in anyway. But yeah, China is relentlessly trying to whoop our ass when it comes to science and technology, and they're beating us. In the PISA, they are absolutely on top, but the Stanford Math Olympiads, there's many, many tests of math prowess and scientific prowess. China's way ahead on the nanotechnologies at this point. And so we have decided, but I mean, I cannot stress enough how bad this is. I get sent on a daily basis notices from my friends in medicine and STEM, the latest announcement from JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, or Lancet, or Scientific American, declaring that our real fight is against racism in science and we shouldn't have standards. It's happening every single day. Trump had the federal science agencies which fund academic science, they are completely conquered by leftists who hate Western civilization. And so race, intersectionality is now the criteria for doing medical research with federal funding. Trump, or he should have gotten rid of it. If we can get a Republican in this next time, he's got to remount the federal bureaucracy, and it can be done. But it is really bad right now.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.